from Toronto.
I'm Joshua. I'm an alcoholic. I'm glad to be here. I want to start off by thanking my friend Katie, who claims to accept all credit for me being here tonight. And thank you for the committee for asking me to be here. It's always a privilege to participate in my sobriety. I have kind of like a love-hate thing with speaking, as in sometimes I love it and other times I totally hate it. I spent the day walking around, and I walked around MIT campus, and I spent a moment like standing near the water, like overlooking the water, like longingly, because what kind of spiritual speaker would I be if I didn't do that? And I was trying to think of what to say, and my sponsor has me do this thing near the end of the year where I list 20 things that I want to work on for the proceeding year, like I guess New Year's resolutions. And 20 things is like excessive. So I try to think of things that like will impress him, like, I don't know, kiss God on the mouth or something like that. But one of them was to take the job of speaking more seriously. And ever since I made that resolution, I've gotten really nervous speaking. Like I actually have become, I think, a worse speaker ever since I've made that resolution. Normally where I just kind of feel like I just come up and naturally give a talk, now I get up here and I don't know what the hell I'm going to say. So congratulations, you get to hear that tonight. I'll start out with stuff that's, I guess, important information. The first being that I am an alcoholic. The second being my sobriety date is October 22nd, 1995, which means that I'll be almost, I'm 15 years sober now, which is impressive if you're impressed by numbers lower than 16 and greater than 14. I have a sponsor. His name is Dan, and he lives out in Toronto, which is where I'm from. And I have a home group called the Primary Purpose Group. If you ever, for some reason, come out to Toronto, we meet on Mondays and Wednesdays, and we'd love to see you. And yeah, that's kind of what brings me here. I was thinking, well, earlier I was thinking about how much I hate speaking, to be honest. And it's one of those things where I try to take seriously because I do believe that this is a form of service, and any form of AA service should, to some degree, be taken seriously. And then there's kind of another level that's totally not serious at all. And here's kind of what I've found, is one is speaking is probably one of the most impersonal ways that I can be of service. And in that way, it almost negates the fact that I don't really even consider this a form of AA service. And I don't mean that to minimize people that speak. I'm just saying that for myself, this is not how I consider being of service. This is just kind of actually one of those things that most of the time is actually pretty cool to do, but it's not something that I believe could keep me sober ever. But here's the other cool thing that does happen ever so often when you do this. I, a couple years ago, spoke in Atlanta at MSCYPAA, and I spoke at that conference 2 days after me and my then wife had decided to get divorced. And so I was kind of like not really there. It was probably one of my hardest talks that I've ever given. And, but I just decided to talk about everything that was going on in my life, which included the fact that me and my wife had just decided to get divorced. And so I gave that talk. And then several months later, I was at another conference, and a woman came up and talked to me. And she said that she just wanted to tell me that she had been in Atlanta and heard my talk, and that she wanted to thank me because she felt that I'd saved her life. And one thing, to just get that out there, I don't believe that actually happened. I don't actually believe that I saved anybody's life by speaking. But what she told me is she had come to that meeting suicidal. And by suicidal, she had come to that meeting with the entire intent of attending the meeting and then going home and killing herself. And I believed her. And she said that she had come there as a last-ditch effort to see if there was anything worth not killing herself for. And for whatever reason, what I said struck a chord in her, and it gave her inspiration to go and talk to somebody about some of the things that she was going through. And she decided to give it one more last chance. To my knowledge, she's still sober and obviously still alive. I tell you that story not because I'm trying to imply that my speaking keeps people alive or that I save lives. but rather to, even for myself, insert a certain amount of gravity as to what it is that we get to do when we're in service in AA. And I try to keep that in mind. So I was trying to think of what to start out with, and often what I like to start out with is to address the newcomers. So if you're new, welcome to Alcoholics Anonymous. If this is your first introduction to Alcoholics Anonymous, the bad news is it's all kind of downhill from here. You probably at the moment feel like one of the most important people in the world, which maybe you should in the very beginning, I don't know, at a conference, but I can assure you that nobody is going to treat you in AA meetings quite the same way we treat you at a conference. For example, we're going to have a sobriety countdown, and if that sobriety countdown follows the normal customs of sobriety countdowns, we're going to end with you. And you're going to come up, and you're going to get a big book, and everyone's going to give you a standing ovation. Sorry, I ruined the surprise. But you are probably going to feel in that moment that getting sober in AA was probably the best idea that you've ever come up with. I think that's why we do that. Because if you're anything like me, the decision to come to AA was probably the best decision you've come up with after a series of very, very bad decisions. And that's what brought me to AA. I was a colossal failure by the time I came in here. And I remember that because subjectively, in the sense that I was a colossal failure, so were you. And that always keeps me from being nervous when I'm speaking. I just simply remember that each and every single one of you at some point in time in your lives were colossal failures. Otherwise, you wouldn't be an Alcoholics Anonymous. And that always makes me feel better. The other thing is the entire purpose of coming to meetings, if you're new, is to get a bit of information of how it is that we stay sober, and moreover, get a little bit of information that may enable you to diagnose whether or not you are an alcoholic. And that's the interesting thing. If you're an alcoholic, you've probably spent a large majority of your life having a lot of people tell you that you drink too much. There's probably been more than a few people that have told you that you're an alcoholic. And often the way that they go about and do that is they will tell you what will happen if you continue to drink. And normally it's pretty bad news. And you might find that AA diagnoses alcoholism in a very strange way. So I met my first sponsor, and the way he diagnosed alcoholism for me is he began to talk about his own drinking. And that was it. If you kind of think about that in terms of kind of medical diagnoses, that would be like going to the doctor with some sort of unknown disease, and the doctor kind of looking at you, analyzing what's going on in your life, and then saying to you, so sometimes I get this weird cough and sniffles. Ever so often I get a headache. Does that sound familiar to you? And that's how we diagnose alcoholism in AA. And I think the reason we do that is because it's highly effective. If you're like me, you're beginning to find that one of the things that's unique that AA does is we tell you what your life might be if you stop drinking, as opposed to continue drinking. Because we already know what's going to happen if we continue drinking. But what a lot of us don't know is what's going to happen if we actually stop. And this was the first place that I was where I met other people who drank like me. And when they talked about what it was like when they stopped drinking, they were happy about it. It was the first place I'd ever been that anyone would talk about the idea of stopping drinking that seemed to be an alcoholic and relay this information like it was good news. Because for me, the problem was when I stopped drinking, I hated life. So, I mean, by that alone, simply physical abstinence would have been insufficient to keep me sober, because every time I was sober, I hated life. So, I mean, part of my problem was I had a very large sobriety problem, and my solution to that was just never be sober, and which makes complete logic to alcoholics. And so that's how we're going to diagnose you, is simply by talking about our own drunk-a-log. And that's what I'm going to try to do tonight. I was born in the Philippines, and I was born amidst a certain amount of scandal. That scandal being that my mother was 16 and a heroin user, and my father was not married to her and also a heroin user, which in the Filipino culture is kind of considered not cool. My biological parents had very tight political connections, and I was kind of expedited out of the country and sent to the United States and adopted by, for lack of better words, 2 white people. And these people adopted me. And on top of adopting me, they also adopted 6 other Asian children. I don't know why. If you ask my mom, she doesn't really know why either. I think it's that same way when you're in a checkout line and you see a magazine at the checkout line, you're like, I'm going to get buy that magazine. I think it just happened with kids. So they're really good people. They probably have a bit of an Asian fetish. And And so they adopted all of us, and I grew up in what I kind of thought of as this super chaotic lifestyle. And I really disliked my parents for a long time. I disliked the fact that they'd made that choice of adopting so many of us and seemed to be very ill-prepared for that fact. For example, when you adopt people, you can just suddenly have 6 kids. Like just bam, there you go, 6 kids. You don't have to wait the typical 9 months between each gestation of a child. You just have them. And I am now at the age of where my parents had all of us. And if I were to like go home tomorrow and then come to my house and find out that I had 6 plants, I would probably freak out. I just noticed that all of you guys are sitting back here. It's kind of freaking me out. I feel like I'm on a game show, like So You Think You Can Speak. So yeah, I have a lot of respect for my mother for what they did, because I now realize what they did was nothing short of heroic. My parents are very good people. If I don't get the chance to say that in my talk, I just want to end with the fact that my parents are great people. Hopefully I'll get to talk a little bit more about that. So we grew up in this really chaotic place. We were very poor, primarily because my dad worked for the government, and we had 6 kids. Like, you just don't have a lot of money going around. And we were the type of poor where my parents were very good at kind of hiding that fact. Like, we had a lot of breakfast for dinner. You know that one? We were like, hey, pancakes for dinner. So awesome. And then like later you grow up and you're like, damn it, we were just really poor. And my parents bought all my clothes from Kmart. And that was a step up, because before Kmart, I just wore clothes that my relatives had worn when they were smaller than me. And then I graduated to clothes from Kmart. And the thing about back then is when you bought clothes from Kmart, they really looked like they were clothes from Kmart. Like, they didn't need any sort of tags or anything. You looked at them, you're like, those are from Kmart. And my mom bought me this one jacket that was very, very Kmart-ish. I mean, to the fact where people would be like, where'd you get that jacket, Kmart? And I'd be like, yes. And so I had this game where I would sort of like misplace this jacket. And then some asshole would always find it and return it to my parents because they'd written my name in it. And I just kind of grew up where it was like, look, Mom and Dad, for starters, you're white. I don't know if you've looked at me recently, but can we just get on board and stop trying to make my life so miserable? I was a very kind of energetic, precocious child. That's not what psychiatrists said, but that's kind of how I would say. I had a lot of sort of adolescent neuroses. For example, I found it critically important that when adults were in my presence, I would lick my finger and touch them on the bare skin. I also felt much better about myself when they didn't know that I was doing that. I like to mentally take inventory of all the metal objects in any given room that I was standing in. If I had enough time, I would also lick my finger and touch those things. I often conducted experiments with electricity in my own urine, which is what prompted my parents to have me see psychiatrists at a young age. So from a very young age, I was definitely in search of something to relieve me from what turned out to be an obsession with myself. Just a complete and total torturous preoccupation with myself. And that's what that is. And I took my first drink when I was 11 years old, and it really couldn't have come any sooner. I think because we were Asian, my parents had this thing where they wanted to preserve our cultural heritage. So when we were younger, they would take us to these things that were, like, I guess, multicultural festivals. And we would show up to them, and it'd be like all the adopted parents and their other colored children, because they're always colored. And we would get there, and the first thing that I would notice is all of these kids were wearing normal kid clothes, like, you know, from Oshkosh B'gosh or whatever, and all of us would be wearing kimonos. Which, God bless my parents, is actually culturally not even appropriate for a Filipino. We don't wear kimonos. So I'd be here, and I'd look around, and I'd see all these other, what appear to be culturally integrated children, and think to myself, this is bullshit. And then I had this grandfather who was my father's father, and he was an angry man, and he called us his little nips, which at the time we thought was like an endearing terminology, and later we grew up and just found out he was like an old racist guy. And what had begun to happen at a very young age is a theme that if you're in this program long enough, you will begin to hear ad nauseum, and that is the theme of feeling different. And I began to hear a very distinct message that was being relayed to me through these circumstances, and that message was, you, my friend, are different. And this is the thing. I ever so often congregate with people that are not alcoholics, and I've come to find that feeling different is a pretty much human condition. Everybody feels different. A lot of us grow up in circumstances that make us feel different. You do not have to be an alcoholic to feel different. We don't have a monopoly on feeling different. I just think we seem to handle feeling different a little bit differently. For example, there's conferences in this hotel probably all the time. I doubt they ever have to announce, please don't sleep outside or in the lobby. And we're sober making these decisions. I was at a marathon meeting earlier, and it was a traditions thing, and it was about Tradition 1, which talks about unity. And the story in the 12 and 12 in regards to unity is about a bunch of military guys that find themselves stranded in a raft, and they quickly come to realize that if any one of them were to demand more than their fair share, they would all surely perish. And it talks about in the sense that we of Alcoholics Anonymous has a responsibility to be here and share freely amongst each other in the hopes that it will keep us alive. And that's the interesting thing. Because the unity isn't necessarily about the social networking that occurs in this. Our fellowship is incredibly awesome, and I honestly believe that there's really nothing quite like it in the world. But I think the thing that really sets us apart is the fact that all of us are social misfits. I mean, most of us had this weird thing where we never quite felt like we fit in, and we did weird stuff, and that makes up kind of the general malaise of social anxiety that makes up the fellowship of AA. And yet, for as large of a fellowship as we're probably one of the tightest mixed fellowships in the entire world. And ultimately, it's Alcoholics Anonymous that brought us all together. And I hate saying this because it's like one of those stupid speaker conference things that you say, but it is true in the sense that never again will all of us ever congregate in this exact configuration as we've done tonight. And AA does that. These conferences do that, where we all get together, some of us from very far away. And for me, I'm kind of far away, and there's a lot of you, well, not a lot, but there's a fair amount of you here that I know, and some of you that are actually close friends. And one of the things that's happened to me is that probably every major city in North America, I know a number of people. And I can assure you it's not because I'm popular or likable. It's just that at one point in time in my life, I realized one of the drawbacks of getting sober young is it might take a while for me to die. Which means, regardless of the whole one day at a time, I'm probably going to be in AA for a very long time if I choose to be sober. And I made the decision that if that's true, then I'm going to surround myself with people that actually enjoy being here. And I just made this decision to give myself over to this program as much as I could and see where the ebb and flow of that does. And the outcome was that I get to spend a lot of time with you guys. And I like alcoholics, for the most part. I went back to school. I'm kind of getting off track, but that's because of my New Year's resolution to do a better job at speaking. I went back to school, and as a result, I spent a lot of time with people that were not alcoholics. And when I was in school, I was just amazed by the fact that it seems like non-alcoholics are just like bees. They just kind of seamlessly move in and out of these social networks, and they make friends, and they hang out, and none of them need to get drunk to do that. And so I'm hanging out with them, and I found that there's a marked difference between the way that AAs react to our lives as opposed to normal people. We were doing this project, and it was late at night, and we've been doing it for a while, and we were hungry, and we started talking about food. I don't know why I told this story. It had very little to do with food, but the end of it had something to do with food. And this is the story I told them after we'd swapped some stories about food. When I was 16 years old, I was institutionalized. And while in this institution, I did some LSD and decided that I wanted to escape. Legally, I was not allowed to make that choice, but I made it nonetheless. Perhaps the LSD encouraged me to do this, but the way I escaped is I stole one of their cars, and I crossed a couple state lines. And after I'd been on the run, me and my friend, for a little bit, we got really hungry, and we called the place up, and I was like, hey, F you, we painted the van, and we're in Mexico. And they're like, tell you what, if you turn yourself in tonight, we'll buy you Chinese food. So we did. And we turned ourselves in, and we were apprehended, and I came back, and I served 3 months of solitary confinement for unlawful flight from a state-appointed institution and grand theft auto. That was my story about food. So after I told them this story, like without really thinking, there was just dead silence, and I look at them, and they're just all staring at me. And this is what I've come to expect after I tell this story in AA. Most people ask me whether or not they bought me the Chinese food. But at the end of that story, they looked at me and they were like, why were you institutionalized? But we don't need to know that here. I mean, people get institutionalized all the time. That's just kind of one of those normal things that happens in AA. Like if I were to tell someone I was in jail, they'd be like, cool, which one? But if you do that on the outside world, it's a little bit different. It goes over differently. I mesh better with you guys, especially when I'm telling you stories that I think relate to food or that I would kind of categorize as normal. And so there I am needing to drink. And I take my first drink when I'm 10 years old, and it's appropriately vodka and Kool-Aid. And I start drinking, and it's at Dan Dustin's party. Maybe some of you were there. And it was that epic party that you get invited to when you're 10 years old, and from that point on, your life changes. You know those parties where you're like, oh my God, I got invited to that party. And I grew up feeling not only different, but just kind of like a nerd. I had a lot of friends, but I always felt like a nerd. And it's funny because I was just telling someone that while I was walking around MIT, I felt very much like I belonged there, partially because everyone was Asian. And they were nerds. And it's funny because, I mean, it really fulfills that stereotype. I was walking around MIT, and there was just like packs of nerds walking around, like on their laptops or on their calculators. And comparably, if you were to go on like the San Diego State campus, it'd be like frat guys like drinking or partying. I don't know why I'm telling this story. Oh, it has something to do with nerds. So I get invited to this party. I don't feel like a nerd. I start drinking, and we shoot fireworks at cars, which where I was illegal. So cops start pursuing us, and they corner us in this field that months later, while I was drunk, I would burn down. And they're asking me and my friends all of our names. So all of my friends are terrified. We think we're going to jail. I don't, but they think we're going to jail because of what we've done. And they're giving up their names, they're giving up their phone numbers, their parents' names, social security numbers, all of that kind of stuff. And then the cop gets to me. And for the first time in my life, I feel the effects of alcohol. And normally in a situation like this, my blood would have ran absolutely cold, and I would have been paralyzed by fear, as in incapable of taking any kind of action. Yet when the cop looked at me and asked me my name, I said, "Sir, my name is Richard Head." And there's two cops, and the cop kind of nudges his buddy and cocks his eye and says, "Son, are you trying to tell me that your name is Dickhead?" And I said, "Well, sir, I've always preferred Richard." And the two cops look at each other and start laughing, and they just say, "Get out of here." And they let us on our way. And so we walk away convinced that all of us have escaped imprisonment because of what I had done. And my friends are patting me on the back and telling me that that's the most awesome thing they'd ever seen. And I knew it was true. I mean, I knew that not only was it the most awesome thing they'd ever seen, it would probably very well be the most awesome thing they would ever see. And if you haven't noticed, we talk about God here, or spirituality, or a higher power. And that freaked me out, really. I wasn't really afraid of the idea of God. I just thought it didn't work. I would have felt more comfortable if you guys told me that the way you stayed sober was by mild radiation exposure. But the idea of God was just sort of this intangible idea where suddenly I felt that I was in a place where probably you didn't actually stay sober. You probably just talked about God a lot. And I didn't think that'd be very effective. Now I kind of understand it. Now I understand why something spiritual in nature would be the thing that would be the solution to my problem. There's this book called Varieties of Spiritual Experiences, and it's a book that Ebby Thatcher gave to Bill very early in his sobriety. And this book kind of tries to break down in a scientific method fashion the phenomenon of religious experiences throughout the years. It was written in like the late 1800s, so it's a very old book. Well, it's not that old, but it's older than me anyway. And Bill read this book, and there are certain passages that seem to jump out at him. And unsurprisingly, a lot of what's talked about in that book is the effect that alcohol has on certain people. And I paraphrase heavily, but one of the lines said simply that drunkenness expands. It ignites the yes factor in the man. It ignites the mystic thing where we are capable of doing the very thing that we are incapable of doing while we are sober, the diminishing sober hour. And he read that, and it occurred to him that that's what we're looking for. We're looking for a spiritual awakening. And I came in here and I was afraid about the tendency of God. And then I read about what you meant by a spiritual awakening. For example, in our literature, the psychic change or the spiritual awakening is described simply as this: a profound reaction in the way, or profound alteration in the way that we react to life. I'll say that again just because for me it really jumped out at me. The spiritual awakening or the psychic change is described as a profound alteration in the way that we react to life. That's it. And when I read that, I realized that that was probably the best description of what alcohol did for me when it was working. A profound and instantaneous reaction in the way that I reacted to life. When I was drunk, I did things that I was incapable of doing when I was sober, and even at the age of 10 years old, I knew that. My first drinking was nothing short of a spiritual experience. I mean, after getting drunk and having that experience with my friends and having them tell me that that was this awesome thing, it was like in the distance I spied God walking over the horizon, long, luxurious hair blowing in the wind, and he just strolled right past us and high-fived me. And that was my first drink. And frankly, I'd have to be moronic not to chase that to the depths that I did. And I have no recollection of when I started. I've also become one of those horrible speakers that has no idea of how long I've been talking. So if you could give me like a 5 or 10 minute heads up, that'd be awesome. Or I could just talk forever. So that's my spiritual experience. And then I find myself institutionalized at the age of 16. I find myself serving 3 months of solitary confinement, being beaten in and out of consciousness by a sympathetic counselor. And then at the age of 18, I'm now homeless in the streets of Seattle, and I'm sitting in a car next to a guy that moments before I would have thought was my friend, with the exception that he's pressing a gun to my head and threatening to kill me. Now, typically, I thought that the way those things happened was bad timing and unfortunate luck. That's always how I kind of summed up everything that was going on in my life. Just bad luck and unfortunate timing. I always felt victimized by the events that occurred in my life because I had no accountability and I had no blame for anything that went on in my life. And the guy was taking unkindly to some product that I'd liberated from him and was threatening to kill me, and I knew that very well he could kill me. 1, because it was nighttime, 2, because we were parked by a body of water, and 3, because I'm pretty sure he had killed people. And 4, the loaded gun pressed against my head was all very good, ample evidence that that might be my last night alive. And the thoughts that were going through my head at the time that this was happening was, please just pull the trigger. I hate myself. I don't know why it is that I do the things that I do, but I can't stop doing them. I can't remember the last time I've had an authentic relationship with another person. My family wants nothing to do with me. I have no real friends that I can think of. I don't know even how to be with people. Every morning when I come to, and I'm unfortunate enough to once again see the sunlight coming through the corrugated steel that's covering the dumpster that I now live in, and then spend the rest of the day wandering around the streets, doing whatever it is that I need to do in order to get what I need. And I catch a glimpse of myself in a storefront window and then cringe with the fact that I lack the courage to blow my own head off. Please just pull the trigger. And that was my existence then. And at the exact same time that I was thinking that, the other thought that was going through my head was, I wonder if I can pop the door handle and roll out of the car before he pulls the trigger. And that was my great internal dilemma. If anything, I thought that is the great alcoholic internal dilemma. That I seemed to lack the power to propel my life in any direction that ever resulted in any good stuff. And what happened is that guy said, this is pathetic, kicked me out of the car and said, do your own work. He knew that I was suicidal and he would rather just have me kill myself than him have the possibility of getting a murder charge. And I wandered off into the night, and I definitely qualified for AA, but I don't know if I could have come here. And the reason I couldn't have come into AA at that time was simply because I had no desire to stop drinking. And without that desire, it's not like that you necessarily would not have had me. It's just that it would have been almost pointless for me to come because I wasn't going to listen to you unless I actually wanted to stop drinking. And that's where I was. I like history. I like seeing how certain things parallel with my own life. I don't know if that's interesting or narcissistic, but I do it nonetheless. And I came across what I felt was kind of an interesting little tidbit. In the early 1940s, a very smart man invented something called the Northern Mark 25, which was one of the first computer aerial navigation systems. Basically, it allowed people to bomb other people with exponential precision. And this was very helpful at the time because America was at war with Germany. So they get this thing, and immediately after realizing they can make select military strategic targets, they put together a think tank to come up with ideas of things that they can bomb. And so this think tank gets together, and what they come up with is ball bearing factories. They're like, we're going to bomb ball bearing factories. And the reason we're going to do that is because without ball bearings, you can't build tanks or planes. So they felt it was an entirely effective target. And so they fly out to the city, and they just bomb the shit out of the ball bearing factories in this city. and they come back and they feel successful because they have decimated, by all appearances, they have decimated all of these factories. They sustained heavy losses, probably losing almost half the fleet that flew in this mission. But they felt that it was worth it under the circumstances. So they come back and celebrate, and they're like, yeah, we got those Nazi bitches. And this entire time, they think it was a successful mission. Years later, after the war, they find out that they had absolutely no impact on the mission itself. Primarily because what they found out is, even though they bombed the hell out of those factories, they didn't actually destroy any of the machines that made ball bearings. And so they literally made no impact at all on the production of tanks and planes. And in fact, after this attack, Germany improved the designs of all their planes and tanks so that they required less ball bearings in case in the future that attack was ever successful. So what happened is they came up with this plan. They executed it based on knowledge that they felt reliable and well thought out. And they executed it quite successfully, and for all intents and purposes, they made the matter worse. I think about that when I think about the plans that I made when I was trying to quit drinking. I don't know if you can relate to this, but a good description of powerlessness is when all of your best laid plans are brought together based on what you feel is reliable, well thought out information. And then you execute those plans, and your life gets worse for both yourself and everybody else. I don't know if you experienced that at some point in your drinking where all of your plans, like your best plans, were making your life worse. That's a very good description of powerlessness, and that's what I was suffering from by the time I got here. And I hit my bottom at the age of 19, and my bottom was simply the painful, undeniable realization that I wasn't who I thought I was. And what I mean by that is no matter how drunk and loaded I got, I knew exactly who I was, exactly where I was going, and for some ungodly reason, I was no longer okay with that. The alcohol and the drugs had ceased to work in my life in the way that they used to, inasmuch that I could not get drunk enough to forget who I was and the way that I was living. And I don't know why that happened. I mean, if you think about the idea of hitting bottom, it's kind of a strange idea, really. We toss that esoteric idea around a lot, like the idea of hitting bottom. And you'll hear people say, I hit a lot of bottoms. But really, like, what does that mean? They used to actually not call that hitting bottom. What they used to call it was ego deflation at depth. They stopped calling it that because, one, a lot of people had no idea what they were talking about, and two, because it just sounded very aggressive. So they came up with the idea of hitting bottom. And I think ego deflation at depth is a much better description of what needs to occur in an alcoholic's life for us to start taking direction. Because this is the kind of ego that I was dealing with. During the time that I was homeless, I often found myself passed out in gutters. There was one particular time that was memorable to me that I was passed out in a gutter, and a taxi pulled up in kind of a well-to-do part of town. And I watched from the vantage point of my gutter as two well-dressed young couple spilled out of the taxi, and to the great audacity, they were arguing with each other, like in public. And I thought to myself, those poor bastards arguing in public. And there I was, face down in the gutter, looking at these people and feeling sorry for them because they're arguing in public. And that was the nature of my ego. Like, that's what I came in here with. And something fundamentally dramatic has to happen in someone's life in order to go from that type of ego to implicitly taking somebody else's direction. And that's what happened for me at the age of 19. And I try not to screw around too much with the fact that I don't know why it happened at that age or whether or not that will ever happen again. I had a friend that relapsed shortly after he took 10 years of continuous sobriety. And he's currently about 4 months sober now, but he had a hard run after relapsing. And one of the strange things that I observed while he was out there was at a time that he was probably the most powerless over alcohol and drugs was a time that he was absolutely convinced that he had control. And this is a guy that had been sober for 10 years and had been very active in AA. And it was astonishing to see someone who had that much knowledge of being in here and to be that convinced that maybe it could work again. I mean, that's the nature of the insanity that's inflicted upon me. As an alcoholic, no matter where my life is, at some point in time, I become transfixed with the idea that maybe I can drink again. And usually that idea presents itself in two ways. The first being is, maybe this time will be different. Even though I have absolutely no evidence that would say otherwise, I just start thinking to myself, maybe this time will be different than all of the rest of the times that were obviously not different. And then the other thing is, sometimes it presents itself simply by this: I don't care. I'm going to get drunk. I don't even care what happens. But that's a lie, too, because obviously I do care what happens. I think people can drink themselves to that point of no return where they no longer care. But I think it's hard to do that, and I think all of us have that moment where we can make the actual decision as to whether or not we want to stop drinking. And I don't know what kind of cosmic forces have to align themselves in such a way for an alcoholic to suddenly start thinking, I don't want to drink anymore. And I just try not to screw around with that fact too much. Shortly after the Jack Alexander article was written about Alcoholics Anonymous and put in the Saturday Evening Post, there was a panel of medical doctors in New York that wanted doctors that had been, like medical profession, that they knew had been instrumental in the genesis of AA to talk to them about why AA worked. And Bill was very hyped up about this. He thought that all of the doctor friends like William Silkworth and all the other people would be ecstatic to go before this very luxurious board and describe how they had helped AA come into being. But none of them wanted to do it. They were absolutely refused to go before this board and talk about any of the work they'd done for helping AA. So he went before them and he was like, he asked one particular doctor, why wouldn't you accept this? I mean, this is actually a pretty lucrative offer. And what the guy told him was this: we love AA. We think it's very effective. In fact, there's nothing more effective that we've seen besides Alcoholics Anonymous for treating alcoholism at this time. We have some ideas as to why it works, but here's the thing we can't explain. A lot of you get sober and then get well very quickly. But more inexplicable is a lot of you are the kind that drink every single day. You will be confronted with circumstance after circumstance that would make any normal person decide to stop drinking, and yet you can't stop drinking. Many of you will make the decision to stop drinking, and you will continue drinking. And then you go to AA, and suddenly you stop drinking. Literally overnight, they saw cases that they had tried everything on, stopped drinking after going to AA. And they said, we can't explain that. From what we understand, you guys call that a spiritual awakening, or the undeniable presence of a divine grace. You guys call that God. And the last thing that we want to do is try to explain to anybody what God is, and definitely not before the New York Board of Medical Doctors. And I find that interesting. I mean, before I start talking about God, I want to say this. If you're new, you don't have to believe in God to stay sober, unless you do, I don't know. But I say that because you might be here and you might have some spiritual misgivings, and you might be like me where you're uncomfortable with the idea that it's possible that we're staying sober by the power of God. So I want to say straight out that you don't have to stay sober by believing in God. If you did, I wouldn't have stayed sober for my first 6 years. For my first 6 years, I would have considered myself an agnostic or an atheist. Here's the thing. There's a line in our big book that says God is either everything or he is nothing. I no longer believe that this is a religious manifesto. I don't think this is a threat. I think it's just a statement of fact. I mean, if you really think about it, it's just a statement of fact. Either God is everything or he is nothing. It's not even like they're making a choice. It's kind of like saying this house is made out of bricks. And I understand that now. And if these steps required implicit belief in God or that they would work, in order for them to work, they would quite literally be a placebo. And that's not what we're offering you. We're offering you a very real solution to a very real problem, which leads me to the steps. I like to try to go through all the steps in the way that they applied my life, simply because I think that fundamentally that is the message of Alcoholics Anonymous, how it is that I work the steps and the result that those steps had on my life. And I came into AA and I found a sponsor. You're going to hear a lot about sponsors. In fact, you're going to pick up on some very esoteric language. For example, the term, my sponsor said. What that translates into, what I'm about to say is true. But the interesting thing about that statement is, if you've been around long enough, literally what I'm saying is, I heard this from a guy that might have been in jail. And at one point in time was homeless and nobody wanted anything to do with. This is what he told me, and therefore it's true. I mean, in certain circumstances, I may as well just be saying, I read on the internet, and it has the same impact. But you're going to hear a lot about sponsorship, and it's important to get a sponsor. Here's why it's important to get a sponsor. You've landed in one of the most odd places in the world. That place is Alcoholics Anonymous. I assure you, you will do better if you have someone that is translating what's being said to you in words that you understand. I found my sponsor based on very important criteria. That criteria was he had an afro, and I thought he'd lend me money. So that's why I picked him. He never lended me money. In fact, he told me to never be reluctant about asking him for money because the answer will always be no. And he was crazy, and he still is crazy. In fact, I saw him recently. And the reason I say that is because Another thing is you do not have to be sane in order to effectively carry the message of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's one of the more interesting phenomenons about AA is that we can effectively carry the message of AA prior to being restored to sanity, which is cool because I don't think my sponsor would have done anything if he had to have been restored to sanity in order to pass the message along to me. But strangely enough, he was the type of person that was capable of articulating the message of AA in words that I understood. And the way that he did it is he simply talked about his own experiences here. He never told me to do anything. He sometimes very strongly suggested, but he never actually told me to do anything. And in fact, often when I would ask him to make the decision, he would say, no, make the decision yourself. But here's the information that I'm going to give you in order to help you make that decision. My sponsor wanted complete and total accountability. He did not want me relying on him to stay sober because he knew that he was crazy. And he knew that if I relied on him to stay sober, I would probably drink again. I've been fortunate that that's always been the type of sponsorship that I've had. And that's fundamentally how I sponsor people too. So my sponsor starts talking to me about the first step. And he asked me a very simple question. He's like, hey, buddy, how's your life going living in a car that you can't live in any longer because your friend needs it to drive? How's your life going? You haven't had a single relationship that you can think of with anybody. Your family wants nothing to do with you. You're completely unemployable. You have 2 pairs of trousers, and your second pair is completely unwearable. How's your life going at managing the way that you're managing it? And when I was honest with myself, I realized that it was going actually quite poorly. And what he was doing that was asking me, is my life going the way that I want it, doing it the way that I'm doing? And when I answered it honestly, I began to see that my life was unmanageable. I had already begun to see how my life was powerless. I had one of the best indicators of what it's like to be powerless over alcohol after I'd been sober for a couple of years. At this point in time, I was living in southern Turkey, and my program consisted of waking up early and running along the coast, usually away from wild dogs that were chasing me. And I would make this jog every morning, and I would stop at a corner store, and I would buy water. And then I would make the hike back to the place that I was working. And this one morning, after a brisk jog, it suddenly dawned on me that the beer was cheaper than the water in the refrigerator. Like, I just saw it as if suddenly that refrigerator had been lit. I just saw that the beer was cheaper than the water. And at this time, I was trying to practice financial control in my life, so I thought maybe this would be a good place to start. The beer is cheaper than the water. Logically, that makes sense to buy the beer. And in that moment, that seemed like one of the most sane ideas I've ever had. But then something else came up, which was, why don't you talk to your sponsor first? So I made the decision not to buy the beer. I went back and made a very expensive long-distance call to my sponsor, told him everything that I'd been doing. He asked me when the last time I'd been to a meeting was. I told him that no meetings existed where I lived, and he told me to start some. So I did. And the way I started it was I simply talked to guys that seemed to be interested in my drinking stories. And we would meet almost every day in my room, and we'd go through the big book. I've now come to believe that none of them were alcoholics. They were just trying to learn English. But they learned a strange vocabulary, such as terms as rigorous honesty. They now know what it's like to make amends. They probably don't talk about anger, but they talk a lot about resentment. And I stayed sober. And I think about that because I see how the powerlessness affects me even in sobriety. No matter how long I've been sober, I'm still a victim to the fact that at some point in time I can be transfixed with the idea that maybe I can drink again like a normal person, even though I literally have never drank like a normal person. I don't even have any past reference point to use of what it looks like to drink like a normal person because I never actually drank like a normal person, and yet I'm obsessed by this idea. I'll drink like a normal person. And the reason I want to drink like a normal person, because if I'm a normal person, I can drink as much as I want because that's how normal people drink. Apparently that's not true. So I've also been transfixed with an idea that is completely inaccurate. And so then I begin to look at step one, and admitting that I'm powerless and my life is unmanageable, the next logical step is to turn my will and my life over to something else. And I come up to step two. And step two is the first time that I begin to read about the idea of God. And I begin to read the idea about spirituality and faith. And at that point, I stopped with my sponsor and I said, I can't go on because I either do not believe in God or I'm unwilling to believe in God, or if God exists, he wants absolutely nothing to do with me. So I can't continue on. I don't know what it's like to live on faith, and I'm pretty sure that I can't ever just live on faith in order to stay sober. And my sponsor would often use stories that I told him as analogies of how the steps work in my life. And this one particular story that I told him is what he used for the second step. During the period of time that I was institutionalized, it was a rule of thumb that when you were in the doctor's office and you saw prescription medication, you stole it for obvious reasons. So I was in the doctor's office, and the doctor left, and I saw this box of medication, and on the box it showed two old people walking down the beach hand in hand, and it said, "For the ease of pain and discomfort." So I stole it, assuming that it was painkillers, and brought it back to the institution. Being the spiritual person that I am, I shared it with my friends. And about an hour later, I suddenly realized that two old people walking down the beach hand in hand, and the words for the ease of pain and discomfort, we had all just overdosed on prescription-strength laxatives. And for the next couple hours, we turned our will and our lives over to a power greater than we understood. And the reason my sponsor used a specific story was what he had pointed out is that I'd lived my entire life based on faith. And what he meant by that was, in that moment, the only evidence I had needed to turn my will and my life over to something was a picture of two old people walking down the beach hand in hand, and the words, "For the ease of pain and discomfort," and instantaneously, I turned my will and my life over to it with the expectation that it would take me where I wanted to go. Definitively, that's faith. And yet I came in here and believed that I could not live on faith. And what he pointed out, it was not the quantity of faith that I lacked in my life, it was the quality. I had spent my entire life placing faith on other things, especially alcohol and drugs. I knew what faith was, I just didn't know what it was like to have faith in something that had the ability to restore me to sanity. And that's all step 2 was for me. All I had to believe at that time that my sponsor had been restored to some modicum of sanity, that he was not obsessed with the idea of drinking every single day like I was. And that's all I needed in the beginning. That was the only idea that I had to believe in order to continue on with the steps. And that's an incredible thing, because ultimately AA is probably a spiritual program by nature. And yet the only precepts we put into what your higher power must be is this, that it have the ability to restore you to sanity, and it be something that you understand. And that's it. Which is pretty crazy if you think about it. Our fellowship numbers in, I don't know, probably like 4 million people, and it's international all over the world in different parts of the culture where different religions are more of the norm. And yet our religious spectrum, our understandings about God and spirituality are all over the spectrum, and the only ideas that we have about what God is what do you think it is? And that's it. I mean, it's one of the things that sets us apart probably from cults. And this is the story that I love about how that came into being. Ebby Thatcher was Bill W.'s first sponsor. And I love that term when he talks about Ebby Thatcher being his first sponsor, because Ebby wasn't, I mean, AA didn't even really exist when Ebby was a sponsor. And this is the kind, I love Ebby Thatcher. Ebby Thatcher is the kind of guy that when he got drunk, he would drive. I don't love that part, but he would get drunk and he would drive. It was kind of okay for him because he was in the countryside, except for this one time that he got drunk and plowed through the kitchen of an old lady's house. And when the lady came into her kitchen, quite surprised to find out that there was a car parked there, he kind of leans out of his car all drunk and says, "Man, I've just stopped by for a cup of coffee." This is Ebby Thatcher. This is Bill W.'s first sponsor. And in the book, there's a very important discussion they have on the initial parts of spirituality. And Ebby Thatcher tells him that he found God. And then they start talking about this idea of spirituality keeping him sober. At that point, Ebby was using the Oxford group. And Bill stops him. He says, "Well, Ebby, if that's the way you're staying sober, I can't stay sober. That doesn't work for me. I don't believe in your God. I don't believe in the God of the Bible, the God of our forefathers. Like, if this is what's keeping us sober, I can't do it because I don't believe in that God." And Ebby said very straightforward to him, "Well then, Bill, find your own conception of God." Now, in the book, in the beginning, I always interpreted it as this very kind of steady, gentle way of saying, "Well, Bill, why don't you find your own conception of God?" Here's how I really think it went down. Ebby was newly sober. If you've ever been newly sober, you're often very irritated with people, especially with people that disagree with you. And so Ebby is newly sober. He's here trying to help Bill, and Bill's being a jackass. And Ebby's on fire because he believes in something, and Bill won't agree with him. You know how frustrating it is when you just found something awesome and the person won't agree with you, and they kind of come up with all these different arguments, and then finally Bill's like, "Well, I don't believe in that God." And I think what Ebby said was like, "Fine, Bill, just find your own conception of God." And from that moment, and I'm not the only one that has that idea, but from that moment of what I think was a mild irritation was the most revolutionary idea of religion and spirituality that ever came about, which is the idea that fundamentally every single man, woman, and child has a conception of God that lies within us. That deep within us, we already know what that God is, even if we believe that thing is not God. And that's the cool thing. Like, what I came to found is those 6 years that I didn't believe in God didn't matter, because I was working a program that had been outlined by something that was far greater than myself. It was a connection to something that was larger than myself and therefore a higher power. Whether or not I believed in God, I was in direct contact with what I now believe is God. And then after I came to that understanding, I moved on to my third step, and I began to turn my will and my life over to that God. And this is how it looked. At one point in time, I was in a relationship in AA, and I broke up with that girl, and all breakups in AA are traumatic. There's nothing more obsessive than breaking up with someone in AA. But if you're like my sponsee and you do it, I'm like, just get over it. So I find myself absolutely traumatized by this breakup. I go to meetings, and what I've done is I've taken every greeter commitment in every meeting that she attends. My grand scheme is that when she walks through the door, I want to be the first person that she greets. And as our hands close over and we're shaking and I look deep in their eyes, I say that one thing that makes her feel so bad that she gets back together with me, even though I'm the one that broke up with her. And that's my plan. Unsurprisingly, I'm going nuts. So I go to my sponsor and I tell him everything I'm doing, and I'm like, what do I do? And he's like, well, why don't you just let go and let God? And I'm like, what the does that mean? I mean, like, in non-sponsor talk, what does that actually mean? And he's like, well, off the top of my head, you could stop stalking her. And what happened is I had approached my sponsor with a problem, and he had given me clear direction in a way that I could help solve that problem. And that's all that it meant in the beginning, to turn my will and my life over to something. Take direction. Like, be in that position where I'm capable of taking direction. Just that willingness to take other people's direction has opened my eyes up to a much larger world of spirituality that I would have been unwilling to look at when I was newly sober. And then that moved to me my fourth step. And I began making that inventory of all the secrets that have been keeping me sick, the resentments. And here's why I think we focus so much on resentments. I don't know if you're anything like me, but in early sobriety, I was extremely resentful and I didn't even know it. I would be going to meetings and have these arguments in my head with other members of the meeting prior to getting there. These were completely made up, fabricated mental arguments in my head, but to me they were very real. So much so, but by the time I got to the meeting, I was pissed off at that person, and I would treat them accordingly. If you're living life this way, you have to medicate yourself. I mean, you have got to, in some way, anesthetize yourself from that manner of life. I mean, the difference between just normal anger and resentment is you're hammering away at something and you hit your thumb with that hammer and you're like, ah, you hammer, and you throw the hammer across the room. A resentment, and it was like, I'm going to find that hammer and I'm going to find all the other tools that he hangs out with and I'm going to pick them up. That's a resentment. That's being obsessed with this idea that I am going to get what is mine. And so I'm living my life based on this. And one of the only proper treatments that I had to this prior to coming to AA was drinking. Drinking put that fire of the resentment out awesomely. You remember being really angry, and then you would drink, and you're like, you know what? I'm being too hard on them. Like, I think if we just had that time where we could talk and I could tell them how I feel, we'd probably like each other. And that's what drinking did for me, up until the point that it stopped doing that. So I start making this list of resentments and my sexual inventory, which was completely undramatic, and the harms I'd done, and I bring this to my sponsor and I tell him these things. And at the end of me doing it, he looks at me and says, now tell me all the things that you didn't write down. And the reason some of my inventory was undramatic is I'd simply not disclose some stuff. I had lived my entire life based on non-disclosure. I like to live in what I like to call the parentheses. As in, I would tell you one thing, but in the parentheses, something entirely different happened. For example, I might say, I like camping. What I mean by camping is I'm homeless and I drink a lot. But what I would tell you is I like camping. So I've lived my entire life based on this kind of non-transparency, and then I bring this inventory to my sponsor, and he tells me that, and it suddenly dawns on me that if I don't come clean, it's possible I won't get what he has. And this is what I've discovered what my sponsor had. He wanted what he had. He liked the life that he was living, and everything in his life in some way he realized he'd chosen. He was accountable to the things that happened in his life, and he felt that what he had in his life was things that he'd chosen. I'd never had that. I didn't even know what that looked like. I didn't even know what it looked like to be happy when you were sober. And that's what he had, and I realized that's what I wanted. And so I started telling him the stuff that I hadn't disclosed. And it was only dramatic in the sense that it was somewhat embarrassing, or it had things to do when I was homeless or when I was younger, or the fact that I'd been institutionalized for 2 years in a place that eventually got shut down by Child Protection Agency for the rampant accusations of sexual abuse and violence to the kids that were in there. And it was all that kind of stuff that I just thought to myself, there's absolutely no reason that I would need to tell another man this in order to stay sober. Like, what kind of jackass program am I in where that's a requirement? But I suddenly realized that it wasn't a requirement. It's just that act of surrendering that does something that I can't do myself. And so I told him. And uncharacteristically, after telling him this stuff, he was very quiet, and he said to me, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry this stuff happened. Perhaps in a perfect world, this wouldn't really happen to anybody. But fortunately for you, this is no longer a reason to live the way that you are living." And I heard him say that. For whatever reason, I heard my sponsor say that. And I became accountable for all the stuff that had happened in my life in a way that I'd never felt before. And I caught a glimpse of that liberation that I'd always heard you guys talking about. How long have I been talking? Oh, shit. Oh, that's why you wrote 10 minutes. Gotcha. So I did work the other steps. I don't have time to explain them all, but safe to say, if you have not yet had an experience with the steps, I really encourage you to find your own. So this is what my life is like today. So I spoke in Atlanta a couple years ago. I announced that I was getting divorced. That was not an advertisement about my singleness. It was just something that was going on. I ended up getting that divorce. It went, I guess, well for any divorce. I mean, it's a difficult thing, but as far as divorces go, from what I hear, it went pretty well. It was a very difficult time in my life, but I was surrounded by people that I love and that love me. And I'm always reminded by my sponsor, who said that in every problem there's a gift. And sometimes we have these problems because we require the gift. And then I'm also reminded by one of my favorite quotes by Maya Angelou that said, whenever there is a difficulty in her life, she raises her hands into the air and she shouts, "Thank you, God, for giving me the opportunity to grow closer to you." And I see that today. I see how my difficulties have changed me into a better person. And the other thing is this. I decided to go back to school. Here's my quick rundown about my academic history. At one point in time, my father wanted me to go to MIT because he'd been accepted into MIT when he was younger and decided not to go to be with his family. At one point, I was accepted into the Academy for Gifted and Talented Children. He thought there was a very good possibility I would go to MIT until they told him that sometimes when they think someone's very smart, they actually turn out to be very stupid. And I was kicked out of school, which made my chances of getting into university very difficult. The other thing that happened is I saw a movie called War Games. And in this movie, the main character hacks into a school mainframe and changes all of his grades into there to the point that he graduates. I thought this was a much better idea to graduate from high school with, so I did that myself. And as a result of that, I graduated high school with a 3.56 GPA, and I was also legally not allowed to touch computers until I was 18. I made the decision to go back to school after I had a very, very bad interview. It was one of those interviews where the guy said to me, "You are grossly underqualified for this job." That's what he said to me. And I'm like, I need to go back to school. So I went back to school. And I graduated recently, and I was hired actually while I was still in school. Here's how I was hired. A friend of mine works for this company, and he was telling me that they were hiring. He didn't know that I actually was getting educated for this. He just simply said it. And I was like, dude, that's what I'm getting educated for. Ask them to hire me. So he gets them to call me. The actual president of the company calls me for whatever reason. He says, "I heard you're looking for a job. We like this guy, so I thought I'd give you a call." So I said, "Yeah, the only thing is I'm a student." He's like, "I don't want to hire a student," and he hangs up on me. I go back to school, and I talk to my design professor because this guy's Italian. He's Italian. No offense, but a lot of Italians know each other. So I asked him, "Hey, do you know this guy?" And I asked him in the vein that if he said yes, I'd be like, "Man, that guy's a dick." So I say, "Do you know this guy?" And he's like, "Yeah, I do. He's one of my childhood friends." And he's like, "Why?" I'm like, "I was trying to get a job with his firm." And he's like, "Oh, I'll talk to him for you." The next day, he calls me back. He's like, "Send me your resume and your portfolio." I sent him my resume and my portfolio. He calls me back again, and he's like, "I'm going to give you a chance. You're going to work freelance." I do my first project. After that project, he offers me a permanent desk at the company. I was recently sitting at my fancy desk working, and I got this email from my mom, and it was telling me that my father had just recently been given a Lifetime Achievement Award for his achievements in the world of engineering, which just makes him the biggest, like the king of nerds, I guess. And I take a break from the house that I'm designing because that's what I do now. And I read this email, and I think to myself, isn't it weird that I used to not want to do or be anything like my father? And that's where I find myself today. I tell you that story because I thought shit just happened. Like, you get sober, and, like, I don't know, recruiters come up to you, and they're like, "Hey, do you want that awesome job that you have no experience in, but you're in AA?" Like, I would hear speakers, and I would sort of miss the part where they talked about the fact that they went to school for a long time, and they did really well, and that they actually showed up to school, which they'd never done before. And I missed that part. I just heard the part where they got offered that job under a series of odd circumstances. But I went to school, and I went to school in the same way that I went to AA, which is I showed up, and I did the best that I could. And then I applied myself in this job, and I have this job now where I'm doing well. And that's kind of my story of that. I'm going to end with the story of my father. This is kind of the summation of what I now think about with God. So I was very resentful against my father for a very long time. During the time that I was doing my inventory, my sponsor said to me, I've become aware of the fact that you're very resentful against a person that you seemingly do not know anything about, which was true. I didn't know anything about my dad. I just hated him. So he said, for part of your amends, you need to find out who this guy is. So I did. And through the process of my amends, I found out who my father was. And I found out that he's a very incredible guy. And for his 65th birthday, I thought it'd be a cool birthday present if we flew out to Denver, Colorado, and tried to hike up this mountain that we used to do when we were little. My father, when I was little, used to take me to Long's Peak, and we would try to summit the peak. And it was just something that me and him did. None of my other brothers and sisters, which was important because I came from a big family. It was unique to have any one-on-one time with any one of my parents. And so this was kind of an important thing for me. So we started hiking up this mountain, and I suddenly started thinking, this is a stupid idea. I'm totally out of shape. We're not going to summit the mountain again. Because the thing is we never summited the mountain because about halfway or three-quarters of the way up, I would get altitude sickness, and we'd just have to turn around. And my dad would always turn around without question, without complaint. And sometimes I'd be so sick that he'd carry me the rest of the way down the mountain. And so we're hiking up. We get to the exact same place that we always have to turn around. I don't get sick, but the rangers come down because a huge electrical storm has just passed over the summit. And they say, everybody has to turn around. It's too dangerous to summit the peak today. So we turn around, and this huge storm comes over us. And we're just getting drenched. And my dad suddenly stops and says, you know what? This has been a great day. Because that's how my dad talks. And I said, Dad, I got to tell you something. I really wanted to summit the peak today. We always did this when I was a kid, and it was always important to me. And I know that you wanted to summit the peak. I don't know if it was just to teach me how to be stronger. But I have to tell you that the fact that I never summited the peak with you, I always felt like I let you down. And he looked at me and he said, I never wanted to just summit the peak. I just wanted to spend time with you. And I heard that. And I equate that to God because here's the God that I found. It's not the God of expectations. It's not the God that's just arbitrarily up there expecting certain things for me to do that when I don't do it, he's all, God damn it! I think it's just something that for whatever reason, unbeknownst to me, in a way that I could possibly never understand, he just wants to spend time with me. And I don't know why that is, but that's what Alcoholics Anonymous has given me. And what I hope is that if you're new, that's the thing that you find. That divine, unmistakable presence of something that for whatever reason loves you so much that all it wants to do is spend time with you. And that's the thing that AA had that I didn't know when I first came here. And you can't see that. I mean, why would you ever think about that when you're just trying to stop drinking? But that's what we have here. And I think that's how we're capable of being the people that we have, who are quite typically very selfish to the core, and we're capable of having these conferences. And we don't just have these conferences so we can get together and have dances, which, by the way, there is nothing more awkward than your first AA dance. But it's not like we just come here to socialize and have fun. On the surface, we do that, and that's awesome. We set this up so that we could carry the good news to you. And that's a weird thing. We set this up for you. We set this up so that you can hear the good news, which is simply this. There's another way to life. And I hope you hear that this weekend. Thanks.